Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the lecture series on psychiatry. Today is our last lecture on the psychiatry series, and the topic for today is substance abuse, which will be taken by Dr. Aishwarya R. Nair, and she is currently working as a assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And her areas of interest: women's mental health, social psychiatry, psychosocial and psychotherapeutic interventions, and consultation licensed psychiatry. Ma'am, over to you, ma'am. And if you have any doubts of any clarification, please put up your doubts in the chat box and we'll be able to answer towards the end of the class. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Nathan. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, ma'am.
Can you please give me a feedback if you're not able to listen at it, if you're not able to hear at any point?
Yes, yes. Now
So
it's clear.
I'll just try to share my slide.
Yeah, slide is visible, ma'am.
Yeah, one second. I'm just going to. So shall we start?
Yeah.
Good morning. Today's topic is on general principles in substance use and management of alcohol use disorder. So before we get on with the topic, let us see why this is relevant. So, as we all know, substance use is a widely prevalent condition with huge impacts on physical health, mental health, legal implications, social, occupational, and financial sequelae, which is secondary to alcohol or substance use disorder. So we find that this is a condition which affects not only the individual but also the family, the community, and society at large. And as far as persons with substance use disorder is concerned, they often access the healthcare system for reasons other than for their substance use disorder. So this is typically your patient who presents to you with RTA following driving under intoxication, or someone who presents to you with pancreatitis following years of substance use. So physicians are at many a times, physicians are the primary contact for this patient. So there is an overrepresentation of these patients in primary as well as general health settings. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is, as we're going through the substance use disorders, something that we need to be aware is that we have to be familiar and follow appropriate clinical guidelines related to pain management and controlled substances. So this in itself can also cause iatrogenic substance use disorders. Now, multiple studies and settings. Can you hear me? So, multiple studies have shown that physicians can be a powerful influence for getting the patient to accept treatment, especially when the physician is empathetic without being judgmental. So, now we'll be looking at the topics under the contents of substance use disorders, under the contents of terms. What are the terms that we come in contact with as we go through this? What are the states that we need to be aware of as you're trying to gauge the clinical picture, the clinical concerns, and the general principles in management? We'll also be looking at alcohol use disorders, specifically at approach to management of alcohol use disorders, because this is the one topic or the one most commonly used substance that presents to ROPD in our settings. I've not gone into details about management or history taking, but I've provided references and further reading for this. So now you would have noticed that the seminar said that the announcement said overview on substance abuse. Another term that I have used in the presentation is substance use disorder. Another term that we commonly come across when you look for manuals, WHO guidelines, is addiction. And also, you also come across referrals where we mention dependence. So, what is the difference between each of these terms and why is it important? It's important because clinically it's important to identify the pattern of use for each substance. So, when with abuse, what you mean is a person who has self administration of any drug in a culturally disapproved manner with causing adverse consequences. Addiction is more about a description of a behavioral pattern followed by the individual with overwhelming involvement with procuring and using the substance. And addiction is a state where there is a high tendency for the patient to relapse. When you're saying dependence, you actually are pointing towards a state of neuroadaptation which occurs due to repeated use of the drug and which necessitates continuation of the drug to prevent withdrawal symptoms. So, how does the person take this trip from a single substance, so from experimenting with substance use to reaching the state of dependence? So for that, it's important for us to know what are the things that keeps us going as individuals. What are the things that gives us reinforcement and why? So the final common pathway for reinforcement and reward in the brain is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. There are multiple natural ways that cause a release in the release of dopamine in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So there are so some of the natural highs can be what can be achievements, accomplishments, the high that you get after completing a marathon, when listening to your favorite music, food, orgasm. So these are the multiple natural ways to release dopamine, and these are the natural highs. So this is mediated by brain's own pharmacy of naturally occurring substances. There are naturally produced endorphins, and this is the morphine and heroin actually acts on the endorphin side. The brain has its own pharmacy for anandamide, acetylcholine, and dopamine. And these are the substances that act via release of these naturally occurring substances. So without this also, we have our own pharmacy in our brain where accomplishments and there are multiple natural ways which cause a release of dopamine. So this is our reward pathway of importance. Please note the prefrontal cortex, ventral tegmental area, and arcuate nucleus, and how it is causing release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens and the multiple neurotransmitters involved. So when it comes to a person who's experimenting with the psychotropic drug, uh, the pleasure that they get and the substance that is released, it occurs in a more explosive way and often causes more pleasure than the natural highs. Slowly, with each repeated use, this bypasses the natural system and stimulate brain receptors, causing the dopamine high. And the other thing about this high, the substance high that you achieve, is that it is more intense and you can achieve it at your disposal. A lot of efforts may not be needed for this. So, this starts off a cascade of neuroadaptation, which leads to withdrawal symptoms, craving, preoccupation for finding the substance, and of course starts on a vicious cycle of abuse, addiction, dependence, and withdrawal. So, what are the other factors that, what are the other stages that the body goes through on a trip to developing dependence? Something that we need to be aware of is tolerance, which is after repeated administration, a given dose of a drug produces a decreased effect. So this is something that you come across as you prescribe benzodiazepines, opioids for pain management. This is due to the pharmacokinetic as well as pharmacodynamic factors. Pharmacokinetic, where this results from an increase in metabolic enzymes. So this causes the faster drug clearance rate. And pharmacodynamic, when the biological adaptation of drug-related traits, such as the ability to maintain balance in the case of alcohol. So, because of the pharmacodynamic factors, you're able to the what the drug does to the body, as with prolonged use, it comes down. So, epigenetic modulation is involved in development of tolerance, and everybody. So, not everyone who takes a substance develops tolerance at the same rate or at the same dose. So, there are multiple genetic factors implied at the rate at which tolerance develops. Some of the other terms that we need to be aware of is rebound. So, rebound is exactly what the term conveys. So, after a break, there is an exaggerated expression of the original condition. And this is sometimes experienced by patients after, sometimes, even after an effective treatment. Reinforcement, as we discussed prior. Relapse is the recurrence upon discontinuation of an effective medical treatment of the original condition from which the patient suffered. So it refers to again the pattern of use. So what we call as lapse is when, say, the person starts taking the substance yet again. And relapse is when he goes back to the old pattern of substance use. Withdrawal is the physiologic and psychological reaction to abrupt cessation of a dependence producing drug. So this is a diagram to illustrate how a person with impulsivity or how a person who experiments with the drug uh, experiences his first high, later how he transits to addiction or dependence. There can be an excessive behavior, and following this, because of the neuroadaptation, abstinence can cause withdrawal and negative effect on the individual. And the individual, often on anticipating this withdrawal or the negative effects, starts compulsively using the substance again. So, if you're looking at it, not everyone who starts or uses a substance experimentally turns into a person with use disorder or addiction. The factors that are moderating this can be many. We look at the three main factors, which can be substance related, related to the person, as well as the psychosocial factors. So the substance-related factors, as you can see, the probability of dependence after first use is maximum for tobacco, followed by heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. Person related, it can be due to the person's family history, past history, including age of first use, premorbid personality factors with impulsive traits and neuroadaptation, coping strategies. Can also be the psychosocial factors that includes availability of drug, the level of tolerance by the family model, or the societal implications for drug use. So all these factors play a role in how the person develops a dependence or his pattern of substance use. Now let's move on to assessment of substance use disorders in general. So the levels of assessment can be brief screening, a basic assessment, and a specialized assessment. And usually it occurs in the stages prior to an intervention, during an intervention, and post-intervention. So in assessment, the assessment is necessarily the same, which includes history, focus history on identifying the pattern of use, identifying comorbidities, trying to attempt cue identification. An assessment of the mental status examination, that is to find out what is the stage of use the person is in. Very focused physical examination to look for the comorbidities. Investigations, which are definitely to confirm the presence or absence of drug of abuse and the physical damage caused by these drugs. So, a reflection on the investigations can be used effectively to enhance motivation of individuals who are otherwise in a state of denial. With regard to their drug use, there are multiple instruments for assessment of substance use disorders. So before we go into management, I would like to speak about the cycle of change. So this is also called the trans-theoretical model of change. This was proposed by Francesca and Di Clemente. So from time immemorial, a very moralistic or sometimes a very judgmental stance is being taken by our culture and society when dealing with persons with substance use disorder. So the trans-theoretical approach has helped us to understand how a person goes through his stages of motivation or the cycle of change. So it's essentially called a cycle because if you're looking at it, starting from pre-contemplation, that is when the person does not have any intention on changing the behavior, to contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and relapse. Um, it is essentially seen as a cycle. So the relapse is also seen as part of the cycle. So this is a model that we use to explain to bystanders also, because many a times there's a lot of effort taken by the person who comes with the patient, efforts taken by the patient as well as the person who comes with the patient. So many a times it's natural for the physician, for the treating doctor, as well as the bystander to feel demoralized when a person goes back to the substance. So with this explanation on the cycle of change is saying that relapse is sometimes an inevitable part of the cycle. So our effort should be concentrated on seeing that a lapse does not go into a relapse, and if a relapse happens, to take the patient back to the pre-contemplation phase. And what we expect, or what the most we should expect, is that each time a person goes through the cycle, they learn from each relapse and grow stronger and take what is known as an upward spiral. So this is important. An understanding of this is important before we move on to management. So management would be based on our treatment goals. The treatment goals has to be essentially drafted after establishing a therapeutic alliance and by the patient and the doctor, treating doctor together. It can be abstinence, harm minimization, and improvement of health, social and occupational function. It can even be targeting the improved quality of life. And based on the patient's status and the resources available, we decide on the level of care that can be met out to this patient. And the levels of care can be level 1 is where there is acute intoxication, overdose, and withdrawal symptoms, and these are managed. Level 2 is when you would achieve short term, when you would aim for short term pharmacotherapy, brief interventions, community care, and general measures of rehabilitation. And level 3 comprises multiple psychosocial interventions with or without pharmacotherapy. And treatment is often determined by the individual's need. And so, two things that we have to keep in mind: it depends on matching the individual's condition, individual's need, the resources available. And complex interventions may not be the most needed or the most desirable. So this is in brief to discuss management of substance use. So use disorders. So we would like to introduce you to this. I'm sure most of you would be aware about this, the 10-step protocol. So the steps that are followed by the treating doctor would be to recognize the clinical picture. Is there use? Is it a use? Is it a harmful use? Is it a dependence use? Acknowledge distress, empathize with the patient, elicit the patient's and family's perspective, take a focused history for assessment of physical and psychiatric comorbidity, physical examination, and investigations, and educating the patient about the harmful effects of the substance, giving them a menu of the options available, and looking into the medical management, getting them to be involved in the therapeutic alliance. Medical management, many a times symptomatic management of, say, vomiting or the gastritis that they've been having is often like a very good stepping stone to build a great therapeutic alliance. Another part would be identification of the cues that causes the person to take the substance. It can be emotional cues when they're not able to control their impulsivity, anger, or cope with the situation. It can be physiological cues. It can even be the smell of the substance. So, what are the ways by which the person can deal with the cues? And if there are any specific problems, of course, there will be specific problems. Identifying the specific problems and counseling for that, and negotiating a treatment plan, compliance, participation, and responsibility, and also making a follow-up plan and continuing to reinforce the patient. Definitely, again, targeting a lapse, not to become a relapse, and also to take the person to the cycle of change. So before we move on to approach to alcohol use disorder, is the content is am I audible? Are you able to hear me well, Nitin?
Yes, yes, yes. Go on, Aishwarya.
Thanks, Arjun. So now we'll move on to the approach specifically for alcohol use disorder. So it is basically the same steps, but we will be looking at it in a little more detail. That is all. So in general practice, it's like we said, it's important for us to identify the pattern of use. So the pattern of use can be broadly categorized into three. Drinking that is not associated with risk, that is less than 14 units per week. Drinking that has resulted in physical disease or psychiatric problems. Here, the harm has already occurred, and a state in which an alcohol has become central to the person's life, with a loss of control over the habit and inability to cut down on its use. So there are multiple screening tools available for use for uh, trying to find out the pattern of use. I'm sure all of you are aware about the CAGE questionnaire. So I also found this audit C interesting. So if any of you are looking forward to including it as part of your routine OPD history taking, this audit C just offers three questions, and the benefit is, of course, CAGE again is the briefest effective screening tool, but it does not detect active and past drinking problem, and also excessive use. So Audit C can be more effective in identifying these problems. And it's also quite brief, like the CAGE questionnaire. So, and this is, I've included this in the references if any of you want to take a look at it. You've also seen multiple uh, research oriented work with alcohol is, detecting alcohol use as part of their research protocol. Many of them I've seen using Audit C. So, might be worthwhile looking at it. So once you've screened for the use, we also would like to look at whether the use is in a dependence pattern. So as we discussed, dependence is like a neuroadaptation. It is a neuroadaptive state. But the expression of this can vary. So if you're looking at the multiple diagnostic manuals, which looks at the dependence, they follow a polythetic format. So they often ask for 3 out of 7, 4 out of 7. So I've not tried to focus on the diagnostic criteria. So I've just tried to introduce the expressions of dependence with which a person comes to us with. So they will have a strong desire to consume alcohol. They might have difficulty in controlling its use. Withdrawal features might be present. Tolerance might be present. And there might be continuous use despite harmful consequences. can also see neglect for other activities due to alcohol, social and occupational impairment. So any of these combinations might be there in our patient, in the patient presenting to us. We have to understand that it's a behavioral pattern, it's a clinical pattern, it's also due to the neuroadaptation that the person goes through. So when you're looking at the clinical scenarios, of course, acute intoxication is a transient state. Patients might be presenting in this state when, say they come to our hospital following traumatic injuries, following poisoning. The management is basically, the goal for treatment is preserve respiration and cardiovascular function until the alcohol level falls into a safe range. It's commonly associated with slurred speech, incoordination, unsteady gait, nystagmus, impaired attention, concentration, and memory, and occasionally stupor or coma. It's important to screen for other drugs or medical conditions. If the patient is found comatose, to screen for other drugs or medical conditions. Management is, I'm sure all of you are well versed with management of the same. It's basically targeted at maintaining hydration, correcting dyselectrolemias, looking at traumatic injuries, poisoning, thiamine supplementation. If you're finding the person to be having hypoglycemia, thiamine supplementation to occur before glucose. Avoid benzodiazepine if severely intoxicated, as it can cause respiratory depression. So now this is a rough timeline for the events that occur during a person when a person goes through withdrawal. Uh, and the withdrawal can be an absolute or a relative reduction in the alcohol consumption. So it can be complicated withdrawal as well as uncomplicated withdrawal. Usually, features of uncomplicated withdrawal like somatic symptoms, tremors occur within 3 to 12 hours. Psychosis usually found within 8 to 12 hours, seizures within 12 to 24 hours, and delirium tremors occur usually within the first 7 to 2 hours. So when there is a person who's in alcohol withdrawal, simultaneously we should be looking at the medical complications, infections, hypoglycemia, bleed, undetected trauma, hepatic failure, cardiomyopathy. So I'm not going into details about this. I'm sure you're well versed with that. But one thing I would like you to keep in mind is the timeline at which we are anticipating these features of complicated withdrawal. So for instance, if you have a patient admitted in the ward following, following fever, and the patient was abstinent on alcohol since admission, seizures are likely within the 12 to 24 hours. But if it is happening in a time period after that, again, that's like a red flag sign to think of other causes. Or for instance, a person who develops delirium can be within the 7 to 2 hours, but usually between the second and fourth day. So someone who is giving history, or someone in whom you picked up delirium on day 1 of admission, it is very important to look into the other causes. Investigations, electrolytes, especially if you find the person to be confused or have in delirium, CBC. MCV is again one thing that is an indicator of alcohol use and probably needing vitamin supplementation. Liver function test, serum creatinine, and blood sugars, especially for patients with age more than 40. Now, when you're talking about management, the stages in management is detoxification and de-addiction. Detoxification is where you are identifying the treatment of medical and neurological complications, management of vitamins and nutritional deficiencies, correction of electrolyte abnormalities, treatment of infections. De-addiction includes what we discussed prior: identification of cues, discussion of changes in lifestyle and philosophy, and also dealing with, also you can, pharmacological strategies for maintaining the patient on maintenance base without going back into a lapse or a relapse. So management of uncomplicated withdrawal, again, main targets would be ruling out comorbidities, maintaining hydration, benzodiazepines for use for management of withdrawal symptoms. So that can be chlordiazepoxide when we want a long-acting benzodiazepine, or lorazepam, which is especially indicated for patients with chronic liver disease. And of course, thiamine supplementation, 100 mg TID, if vernix is not vernix encephalopathy is not suspected. However, if there is an admission, especially in a tertiary care setting like ours, we should take into consideration guidelines that argue for parenteral thiamine supplementation. So that might be uh, this particular admission might be a point at which we might be able to intervene and supplement the needed vitamin for this person with alcohol use disorder, and probably, preventing a Wernicke encephalopathy or a Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome from developing. Antipsychotics generally are seen to lower the seizure threshold, but we do use antipsychotics if there is agitation, psychosis, and for symptomatic management of DT. So we try to give it at a low dose, mostly always at a starting dose. If needed, IM can be given, but promethazine is to be avoided. Haloperidol is the IM antibiotic, is the antipsychotic that is available in a parenteral preparation. Can give up to 5. I think 5 is a reasonable dose, but avoid promethazine because it can precipitate delirium. So now delirium tremens. So this is a syndrome that is characterized by hallucinations. So basically, there is a confusion. The person is not oriented with features of tachycardia, hypertension, hypothermia, agitation, and diaphoresis. So some of the salient features that you see, this is typically the person who gets agitated at night with a fluctuating sensorium. But before I go on with that, the sundowning is a basic feature in any presentation of delirium. Delirium due to infective causes, metabolic causes. Always we see this feature of sundowning. The person gets more agitated at night. And the sensorium is fluctuating. So it's not like cross-sectionally say you see the patient at 10 o'clock in the morning during rounds and the person is oriented to time, place, and person. But that doesn't rule out the delirium because it's what you're looking for is a fluctuating sensorium, which typically worsens at night. So that is the picture that you're looking for in delirium. So now, delirium tremens, that is due to alcohol withdrawal also, this is what we see. Delirium tremens is predisposed by a person with past history of, in individuals with past history of complicated withdrawal, and there is a concurrent illness. Sorry. So this is when the state of delirium tremens can be in a person, can occur in a person, especially when they are predisposed by a past history of complicated withdrawal, when there is a concurrent illness and chronic medical comorbidity, when there is a daily heavy and prolonged ethanol consumption, severe withdrawal symptoms. When you see the patient at presentation itself, if the person reports intensive craving and there is a severe withdrawal that you're picking up at presentation, generally in individuals with older age, with comorbid thrombocytopenia, hypokalemia, structural brain lesions, and elevated blood level of homocysteine. So these are seen as some of the predisposing factors, and these can also be some. These are also some of the common factors that maintain a presentation of delirium. So many times we see that the delirium that we pick up in medical wards are often multifactorial delirium. It's not. There are multiple contributing factors. So the comorbidities, especially the electrolyte abnormalities and the metabolic derangement, predispose, precipitate, and maintain the delirium. So even if it's a small difference in the so say the sodium or the potassium, correction of it can help to get the person out of delirium early enough. And also there are multiple studies that show that if the person has say cognitive a lot of cognitive symptoms during delirium which are maintained by the dyselectrolemia, the multiple studies have shown that some of these do not revert, so they do continue to have experience some cognitive symptoms after recovery also. Use of physical restraints should be minimal. We should monitor temperature because the physical restraints can seem to increase the temperature, produce rhabdomyolysis, and cause physical injury. Another thing is whenever we have a lot of patients getting admitted during the summer season. So the role of hydration in preventing a delirium, a complicated delirium, is a lot. I mean, there is a huge role played by maintaining hydration. So when a person is delirious, it is better to avoid excessive stimulation. Watch out for refractory delirium, in which case again to screen for comorbidities. Another entity that we should be aware of is Wernicke's encephalopathy. The etiology of this is due to vitamin B1 deficiency. It's at the stage of a Wernicke's encephalopathy, it is acute and it's reversible. And the Keynes criteria is what we apply. If you get if you get any two out of these four factors, including nutritional deficiency, altered MSC, oculomotor abnormalities, so cerebellar dysfunction, you have to diagnose Wernicke's encephalopathy. This is important again because it is a preventive, it is a reversible condition. The treatment, 4 ampoules of Diamel IV 3 times daily for 3 to 5 days, followed by 2 ampoules OD for 3 to 5 days. Basically, what you're looking for is an improvement. As long as the person improves, there is rational continuing the dose. 400 mg IV Diamel and 100 ml normal saline is what we generally give based on the preparations available here. So, sorry, again, just Wernicke's encephalopathy. As we saw prior, there are multiple guidelines which says that prior to, even if the complete the 4 criteria or the 2 criteria is not met, if you clinically have a suspicion of the syndrome evolving, it is always better to give off the parenteral Diamel. Now, we have to consider hospitalization or referral. Say you're managing this person as OP, you have to consider IP in case of complicated withdrawal. If there is a polydrug use with severe psychiatric or medical disorder, then there is significant suicide risk, any features of Wernicke's encephalopathy, hypothermia, hypertension, and if you're planning on intensive steps in psychosocial management. When we are taking the person through the phase of de-addiction, our target would be continuing efforts to increase and maintain high levels of motivation for abstinence, working to help the patient readjust to a lifestyle that maximizes his function and decreases the risk for drinking, relapse prevention strategies, and looking at pharmacological strategies. So now let's look at some of the pharmacological strategies in management. So naltrexone, it acts by antagonism of new opioid receptors. Dose is about 50 mg per day, and the cost is around 500 for 10 tablets. That's roughly for 10 days. It's shown to decrease the time to first drink, time to first episode of heavy drinking, and duration of cumulative abstinence and number of standard drinks consumed tends to be lower for those persons with naltrexone. Then about disulfiram, it is an alcohol deterrent. So the idea when you give disulfiram is not to cause an alcohol disulfiram interaction, because it can be fatal multiple for people with, especially for people with comorbidities. It's used as a deterrent. It's one of the drugs that is most I mean, as far as expense is concerned, it is much cheaper when compared to other drugs, and it's widely available. I think government supplies are also there. The dosing is from 250 to 500 mg. Adverse reactions mainly hepatic, neurological. So it's contraindicated in persons with CLD, cardiac disease, or cerebrovascular disease, and those with risk of hypertension. Acamprosate. Acamprosate is actually the one drug that you can give for a person with chronic liver disease also. It has a dosing of 666 mg TID. It's slightly more expensive when compared to the other two drugs. But it has proven benefits in reducing drinking frequency and on enhancing abstinence or reducing time to first drink. Some of the other drugs are nalmefene, baclofen, SSRIs, atypical antipsychotics. So now let's look into the psychosocial strategies for substance use. So I basically for substance use management, what is found ideal is a biopsychosocial model of management. So we've looked into, in this presentation, we've looked into the biopsychosocial model in conceptualizing the patient, in trying to, in getting a formulation on the patient and the patient's pattern of use. So when it comes to management, we've also looked at the pharmacological options available. And let's look at the psychosocial strategies. They're evidence-based, especially in combination with pharmacological strategies. The outcomes expected, the outcomes targeted are reduction in use, abstinence, improvement across a broad range of areas, including physical health, risk behaviors. They targeted at increasing the person's self-efficacy and also his responsibility in the substance use. So it can be psychotherapeutic approaches like CBT. So there are especially CBT or psychotherapeutic approaches which focus on specific goals like relapse prevention, community reinforcement, others being contingency management, motivational interviewing. Multiple brief interventions are found to be effective. Some of the interventions can be attempted in your medical OPD as well. 12-step approaches, and I'll be talking about behavioral medical management. So combined studies, a study which found that naltrexone in combination with the psychosocial strategies of the rendered best result for maintaining relapse. Also for maintaining abstinence and for preventing of relapse. So the behavioral medical management, what you're basically looking at is monitoring of adherence and monitoring of adverse drug reaction, monitoring of use, symptoms, and progress. Education, you're trying to educate the person regarding the substance use, what are the sequelae to it, and also giving a menu of available treatment options. Then also encouraging the person to join community mutual self-help groups. So all this should be done without imposing a requirement on the person and in a non-judgmental way. So we can use the FRAMES model where the therapist gives a feedback, also tries to elicit responsibility in the person, advice about the symptoms or the sequelae, give them a menu of options, be empathetic at the same time, work on self-efficacy. So we will come to the, I think I tried to sum up the biopsychosocial module for management of substance use. So shall we look at a few clinical scenarios? So if you have a person, a 35-year-old who works in Gandhi Street, brought to the emergency with history of palpitation, flushing, sweating, blurring of vision and confusion, after having about 180 ml of brandy with a strength half an hour back. Say he was bought by his co-worker. He appears flushed. Pulse rate is rapid irregular. BP is 90/60. What are the differentials that you would consider? Can someone answer?
If anyone can answer the question. Otherwise, we'll move on.
All right, so if this is happening in casualty, please consider the differentials. I mean, some of the differentials that you have to consider is, a person with disulfiram alcohol interaction. So the history that you have to elicit is whether the person is on disulfiram. If so, you have to be aware about the complications like respiratory depression, myocardial infarction, seizures. Please read upon the management advice for this. The other differentials should be methyl alcohol poisoning. So if GRBS was found to be 50, what would you do? What would you like to do? Basically, you have to give your thiamine prior to giving the glucose. So this is another clinical scenario where there is a 45-year-old person with atypical chest pain. Following organic evaluation for organic causes and ruling out, the person stopped the medication she was on. So the symptoms that is listed here is probably due to a benzodiazepine withdrawal. So you can see that she was on acetylcholine plus. The management would be a slow taper. So if the person is on clonazepam or any of the benzodiazepines, if you stop abruptly, it can precipitate withdrawal in the person. So you have to come down on it very gradually to be about 0.1 to 5 of clonazepam in every 2 weeks till you reach 0.25. And otherwise, if there is history of long-term use, maybe 0.1 to 5 every month. So, subscribers would like to conclude by taking a look at this widely relevant problem, being aware about its impact on physical and mental health, and also the implications on financial, legal, interpersonal, and occupational issues. So, the features of substance intoxication and withdrawal is unique for each substances. However, the general principles of management can be applied in all the case scenarios. Physicians can conduct brief and effective interventions for the patient, and when the physician has had a long-term and trusting relationship with the patient, they can play a major role in influencing the patient's behavioral change. These are our references. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Aishwarya. I think that was a very informative, very detailed, and very simplified and approach to what we had got there now. I think it was a very quite relevant topic for us also to manage and identify and manage at least to some extent, and then maybe referring. If any questions, please ask. You can drop down questions in the chat box. We'll be uploading this lecture soon now, Department of Medicine YouTube website. So anyone who missed out on lecture can please be told to access this lecture there. You can also mail if any doubts to medto@cmcvela.ac.in. No further doubts. I think we'll wind up. Actually, I think we're really grateful to have had taken this lecture for us, and then also thanks again for taking your time out for that.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
So we'll wind up for today. Thanks, Aishwarya.
Thank you.